Hello, 423 and 523 students. Today I'm going to be giving you a couple of thoughts on probably our greatest American poet, Walt Whitman. Now, I know that when I say greatest American poet, a lot of students start to roll their eyes. Not everybody's a Whitman fan, and you don't have to be, but he is clearly our most important poet. And this has nothing to do with gender or the fact that he's an old white man, but the issue is that he is a fundamentally American poet. He inhabits the worldview that is functional both pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. In other words, he encapsulates the spirit of both ages, and he transitions along with them. He is also one of our first poets to not actively be imitating European writers. He's not writing in form. He invents his own metrical style, and some scholars have tried to actually scan that and figure out what that is, but it's so complex or random, depending on which way you look at it, that no one's really successfully been able to figure out what he's doing, except to realize that most of his poetry, instead of being derived from Italian or French forms or even Shakespearean forms, seems to be mostly drawing from biblical verse, especially the Old Testament verse, and like the Song of Solomon, and probably quite a bit of Eastern poetry, as he was getting it through some of the more important scholars of the early 19th century, early to mid 19th century in America, like Emerson and Thoreau, who are definitely important figures to him. But the Whitman that we're looking at in this class is not the Whitman that you're probably used to. The Whitman you're used to paying attention to is the Whitman of Song of Myself. And I'm just going to read a little bit of of his work to give you a sense of what that poet was like compared to the poet we're doing right now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare some passages from his most important and well-known poem, Song of Myself, and one of the later poems that you're asked to read that was published first in the 1860 version of The Leaves of Grass. And it'll give you a sense of how he's changed and moved. Now, so let's start with reading a couple of early sections of each poem, okay? This first part is from Song of Myself. Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectres in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. So there's the Whitman we know, the arrogant, sensitive, intuitive Whitman who says, you don't need to go to a library. Just spend an afternoon with me. Sit down, have a smoke, have a drink. We'll talk. You'll learn everything you need to know in the world. Because he really believed that if you put your hand to the side of a tree and you are intuitive enough and you are spiritual enough, you will feel the tree. You will understand the tree. And through the tree, understand all of nature. That's Whitman. And through nature, God, divinity. And he's pulling all of that from transcendental ideology. Here is a comparative line from As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life. O baffled, balked, bent to the very earth, oppressed with myself that I have dared to open my mouth, aware now that amid all that blab whose echoes recoil upon me, I have not once had the least idea who or what I am. Not once had the least idea who or what I am? Walt Whitman? Who's this guy? How does that happen? How do you get from I am large, I contain multitudes to I not once had the least idea who or what I am or where I'm going? Also in that poem, he talks about the shores I knew not. Well, from his original philosophy, that interconnected transcendental philosophy, there are no shores you know not. If you know one shore, you know all shores. So something has fundamentally changed. Now, this is 1860, so it's before the onset of the Civil War, just before it. But certainly the rumblings are happening. You have the Missouri-Kansas conflict, where, and certainly this would be part of Whitman's knowledge, where a lot of people like, why is there a city named Lawrenceville in Kansas? Well, there's a city named Lawrenceville in Kansas because when Kansas was coming into the Union, there was a vote to see whether or not it would be a slave or a free state. So the abolitionists in Massachusetts moved en masse, hundreds and hundreds of people, down to Kansas to vote in that election so it would enter as a free state. And that resulted in people from Missouri, Joseph Quantrill and his raiders, going up into Lawrenceville and basically burning the city down and killing everybody in it. So this optimism and brio and sort of idealism that Whitman carried was already starting to become eroded. So As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life is a very important transitional poem. It's moving Whitman away from transcendentalism and more towards this realism and even towards existentialism. He becomes a proto-modern poet, and in some ways a much more interesting and conflicted one. Two more example passages. Here's the end of the last section of the final version of Song of Myself. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed wilds. It coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air, I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me, at first keep encouraged. Missing me, one place, search another. I stop somewhere, looking, waiting for you. So much optimism. Even after I die, I'll still be there under your boot soles and I'll be a part of you. It's a very similar ending, actually, to As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life, but it's a bit more tentative. Now, I don't necessarily see this as a depressing end, but it's a different one. And Whitman starting to recognize that if he is going to be interconnected to every man, it does mean that he has to participate in their pain and their confusion and their loss and their grief. And this is the Whitman that we get. It's really preparing you for the Whitman of Drum Taps, when he becomes a nurse and actually witnesses the carnage of the Civil War firsthand. Those Drum Taps poems are written from the eye perspective, from a man who's been there and seen piles of limbs from Civil War. But this ending is where he's trying to work out with it. Okay, well, I don't know everything. I can't know everything. I can feel everything, and that is not always easy. Me and mine, loose windrows, little corpses, froth, snowy white, and bubbles. See from my dead lips the ooze exuding at last. See the prismatic colors glistening and rolling. Tufts of straw, sands, fragments buoyed hither from many moods, one contradicting another, from the storm, the long calm, the darkness, the swell. Musing, pondering, a breath, a briny tear, a dab of liquid or soil. Up just as much from out of fathomless workings, fermented and thrown, a limp blossom or two, torn just as much over waves floating, drifted at random, just as much for us that sobbing dirge of nature, just as much when we come that blare of the cloud trumpets. We, capricious, brought hither we know not whence, spread out before you, up there, walking or sitting, whoever you are. We too lie in drifts at your feet. So again, we're under your feet. But it's not just I anymore, it's we. And the you is complicated. I mean, the you that he's talking to, is it the reader? Is it God? Who is that you? And in the poetry, the you is also always the poet himself. So there's this collapsing of the I, the we, and the you, and this collapsing of time as well. Wallace Stevens, a modernist poet, has a line in the final soliloquy of the Interior Paramour where he says, in which being as if in a room where and you have one candle, I'm butchering it, but the last line is in which being there together is enough. And that seems to be the solace that Whitman is reaching for, is this common humanity that does not make things easier, but at least it opens up the capacity for love and empathy, and maybe to the end, ultimately, not only of slavery, but conflict as well. And that's an idealism we should all be able to get behind. That's about all I've got for you today. I hope that was relatively useful to you. And enjoy Whitman. You have to at least get behind the man's spirit, even in the darker poems.